Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers who are watching our YouTube channel. I am your political host, Will Wright, and we have a special, I don't know if you want to call it a midweek, because this will be released on Saturday. Anyways, it's a special episode because we have a special person here with us. We have this Diana Florence. She is returning to help us break down, I guess, this, I don't know if you call it a decision or ruling on the Trump tower debacle thingy. So yeah, welcome back to the show, Diana.
Thank you so much. This is like the latest segment of Harry Potter or something like that.
Oh, Dumbledore died today.
Yeah, so sad.
It's pretty sad. So yeah, I suppose just so we can kind of jump right into it. I do have to know if you are, or number one, like where are you at on the Daredevil series? Let's get to the heart of the topic here.
I'm midway through season 2, but my son went back to college, so I'm probably on a hiatus until Thanksgiving because it's more fun to watch it with him because then he gives me all the Marvel cinematic
backstory
text. Yeah.
Also, well, okay, so
it's like watching a Shakespeare play with a Shakespeare expert. You don't really understand the same level.
That's true. That's true. It is really good though. All right. So let's flip the switch and get serious, I suppose. Okay. So tell us about this decision that happened. So we will kind of maybe start broad, 30,000 foot, and then we'll kind of get into the weeds a little bit. So tell us about this decision. How do we get here? And maybe any other sort of little specifics that you might think it's important to our conversation.
Sure. And I'm just loading the page 35 and page 35 of the decision. And the reason that that's the significant page for anyone who wants to follow along is that's essentially, after all the reasoning, that's where the judge kind of orders things. And this is indeed a decision. But let's take a step back before we get into what happened and just sort of frame it in terms of what, where this case even started. So in 2019, Letitia James, New York State's elected first female attorney general, also a woman of color, she began an investigation into Donald Trump. And that investigation was civil, not criminal. And all the other cases that, I've come on to talk to you about have been criminal. So this is different. And she was proceeding with an investigation under the general business law, which involved fraudulent representations. Now, some readers or some listeners rather may be thinking, okay, isn't fraud criminal? And the answer is yes, it can be, but it also can be civil. And so this is under the Attorney General's powers to investigate. And specifically, she chose to investigate a certain group of LLCs, limited liability corporations, under the Trump Organization umbrella, as well as some named individuals, including Donald Trump himself, his 2 sons, Eric and Donald Jr., Alan Vesselberg, and I think there's one other name that I'm escaping me, but I think it's the another financial guy in the company. But basically, and then these 10 other LLCs. And again, it had to do with fraudulent misrepresentations under the general business law. And what it had to do with is that it sort of pointed to, these sort of very convenient overvaluations in cases where there are, bank loans or loans where these properties are serving as collateral. So, for example, Mar-a-Lago, was valued at, $1 billion when in fact, the assessed value, and we can talk about what the assessed value with the significance of that was, just $18 million. And then, of course, when it came time to pay taxes, you don't want those giant valuations. You want the lower valuations. And so, he made sort of, the opposite statement. So that's essentially the fraud that was alleged. And because of the way the New York State law, and there's the civil law, the general business law, and then there's a criminal component, which the Attorney General could have proceeded under and chose not to for reasons that probably aren't relevant right now. I'm happy to explain why I think. But it would just be my opinion. The Martin Act, right? They both have to do with representations. But the thing that's really interesting in New York is that the standard is not whether you believed that it was true, but whether it's objectively false, right? And so that was the case. Now, what's unusual about this case is not that it was brought, because back and one of my friends and colleagues, Mitchell Epner, who's also done a lot of podcasts, he reminded me of this really good point, which is Eliot Spitzer, our former governor with a bit of a past, but before he was a compromised governor, he was a sort of high-flying attorney general, and in the early aughts, when he was attorney general, he used the Martin Act to go after many financial services companies on Wall Street for the same idea of these false representations. But what was interesting about those cases, which is different than Trump, is that all of those companies who were basically saying, no, we didn't collude with our research side and our sales side, they realized that whether or not they did or they didn't, they realized the facts looked really bad and they needed to settle. So they made, so Spitzer, part of the reason he ended up becoming governor was because of these incredibly, onerous settlements that he was able to get out of these companies. Here in the Trump case, why we are here, and then we can delve into the decision, is that Trump said, no way. He said, I am not settling, give me your best shot. And here we are, in one, probably, I can't think of any in my lifetime. And I think that they're, so rare for a judge to order the dissolution of companies, but that is literally the corporate death penalty, which basically, emanates from Trump saying, I'm not settling and we're going to go forward. So that's essentially the history of the case, and that's what happened, but we can talk more about the details, obviously, because that's sort of a very broad statement.
Yeah. How much of this has to do with like the Michael Cohen element? Because I remember distinctly just him testifying to Congress specifically about this. So it's almost like everybody already kind of knew this happened because he testified to it. So how much connection does it have to Michael Cohen?
Not much. I mean, because this is really about, and that's part of the reason that this case is so devastating. And it's about the numbers. It's about what was put on paper, both in the, sort of tax side and both on the, the bank side, the Deutsche Bank and things like that. So, Michael Cohen might have testified, about these areas, but his part is really what's covered in the criminal case at the Manhattan DA's office, not this valuation stuff.
Okay, got it. And I guess why did it take so long? I mean, like the decision, talks about stuff that happened in the early 2000s, and you would think that if this is something that's been perpetuating for so long, like where's the oversight, or right. Like why didn't previous AGs take this case?
Well, I mean, I think it's arguable to say that Trump has raised his profile becoming president, and I think that probably does make a difference. I mean, that he did raise his profile. It's not necessarily to say that he wasn't engaging in these acts. He was, right? That's what the judge has sort of ruled for the most part. But, actually what's interesting is that the case itself, the sort of, the court papers, if you will, that commenced the action, not the investigation. The investigation started in 2019, but the case itself only started about a year ago in 2022, in fall of 22. I think it even was September. So it's maybe 13 months, not even, that it's been going on. So in that way, it's kind of quick. And why it's quick is, and I think, if you want me to, and I can, or I can wait for you to ask your follow-up, I can sort of kind of give you an anatomy of how like a civil case is versus a criminal.
Yeah. That'd be great.
Right. So, civil again, civil cases and criminal cases. So, criminal cases, the end result can result in the loss of your liberty, right? So that's why the standard of proof is higher, and obviously, any old person can't just criminally prosecute you, right? It's a very specific power, allocated to the government. Civil cases, of course, you can sue a person, the government can sue a person. Civil is a little bit broader. And the ultimate results of civil cases are monetary. I mean, there can be equitable relief, meaning, you have to do something, but it's never going to involve you going to prison or jail. So that's just sort of the main distinction when you think civil versus criminal. Because of that, the burden of proof is lower. So in the criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt, not a shadow of a doubt, but it's pretty high. And in civil case, it's preponderance it's a preponderance standard. So it's a preponderance of the evidence suggests that, more probable than not kind of thing. So I know these are all sort of, loose terms, but just for argument, it's the reason, famous example, it's the reason that OJ, they didn't convict OJ, but he was found, liable by a civil jury for the deaths that he was acquitted of, because the standard of proof was lower. We can get into the politics or whether the criminal decision was right or wrong, but that's the difference. So this, in a civil case, just like a criminal case, and we'll just start talking about this, they get started with an accusatory instrument. So in a criminal case, that would be an indictment or a criminal complaint. In a civil case, it's a complaint. In criminal cases, they're often much sort of more kind of vague. They're just kind of saying you violated, grand larceny or the murder statute or whatever. And saying that you killed so-and-so, and doesn't give you, you had a fight and all that stuff. It will just say on June 4th, you killed him by stabbing the blah, 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 right? So it's very basic, fills all the elements of the crime, and that's what can get a criminal case started. Again, if there's a grand jury system or probably there's different hearings, but the actual accusatory instrument, the paper, is often kind of not particularly revelatory. Sometimes it's a speaking indictment, but generally not. Okay. So civil, since we're talking about civil complaints are fairly specific. They go, into somewhat kind of depth of, of what they're alleging. And then in a civil case, so in a criminal case, after you're arrested on the complaint, you plead guilty or not guilty. In a civil case, your civil attorney, the defendant's civil attorney, because they're both called defendants, right, will issue an answer, and they'll say, so let's say if the civil complaint has a list of 10 things that they're alleging. In the answer, the civil defendant will say, I admit 1, I deny 3, I, deny, and then I'm going to counterclaim, and it can kind of go from there. Once the answer is filed, then it goes to discovery. A bill of particulars will be demanded. That actually can, and discovery and bill of particulars, it's something in criminal cases too, where you have to, now you have to flesh out, so whereas the civil case will be more descriptive, discovery is where you really learn the meat and bones of what is being, alleged. So in the Trump case, for example, right, they can say all these things, but now they have to produce all the underlying records and valuations that sort of say, hey, he lied here, or he falsely represented certain things. So after all of this sort of bill of particulars where you have to specify things and turn over the documents and things like that, which again is somewhat similar, a little bit, it's a little different in criminal, but we won't go into that here. There are motions, and so you can move to dismiss that it's not a facially sufficient complaint. Again, similar in criminal, there'll be other things in criminal. And in the end, in a criminal case, you might ask to move to dismiss it. You can do that here. But what you can't do in criminal, which you can do here, which is very relevant here, is you can move for summary judgment. So in a criminal case, because we have a right to a jury trial and things like that, right, you can't just say, okay, now that I've written all these good things in my motions, as the DA, I'm now going to say, just find him guilty. That's basically what summary judgment is, saying, no, there's no longer any question of fact. I'm satisfied you're guilty, right? That would be anathema to our US Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
It can't happen. In the civil world, no, that's exactly what can happen. So what happened here, and that's exactly what happened in the Trump case, which is at the end of sort of that discovery period, the parties, and you can both move for summary judgment. The defense can move for it, saying, yep, they sued us and, there's nothing here, right? And the government said, okay, look at all the things we've now proven to you. We're moving for summary judgment. And what summary judgment means is there is no issue of fact to be decided on at trial, so that we need to, we can move on to the penalty phases, right? So that's essentially what happened here. And what is that, well, summary judgment, decisions they're not rare, but, they're not, it's not like something that happens all the time. What is exceedingly rare about this, and why I'm flabbergasted, and I've been flabbergasted, frankly, since the alerts came up on my phone on Monday night, or was it Tuesday night, that the judge is ordering dissolution, and then, as I said before, that is the corporate death penalty. That is essentially the judge saying these companies are dead. So that is kind of big anatomy, and that's kind of where we are. Next question.
Yeah. So that just, it just seems really like, for something this huge, it just seems like there would be a jury or something. So so in a civil case versus a criminal, is the primary difference the breaking of a law, or does it have something to do with the parties that are harmed? Does that make sense? Oh, did I lose you?
Sorry, you broke up at the very end there. I don't know if just
a bit. Okay, yeah. So,
but you said so.
Yeah.
Please, thank you.
Yeah. So is the primary difference between a civil and a criminal case like a matter of who gets harmed? Because it just seems like something of this magnitude, of this scope, like the Trump empire being dissolved. It just seems like one judge literally has that much power to do that.
No, that's not the difference. Honestly, the difference between criminal and civil is about, again, it's the liberty versus money. They're both breaking laws. It's just, this is a civil law, right? Arguably, this could have been a criminal case in some ways, right? It's just that the penalties here are draconian, and because even though we know because of the Supreme Court and Mitt Romney, we've established in the modern age that corporations are people, right? They have religious rights, they have the right to, to fund political candidates. We've made that clear, and that's true. They can, they can buy property, they can sell property, they can do things in that way. But ultimately, you cannot send a corporation to jail. And so that's what's always been, when I was a prosecutor, that was always a little bit of a frustration with a criminal case against a corporation, and why you always sought to get the people behind the decisions, because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a fiction, right? They don't have a pulse. And, it is what it is. So the worst thing that you can do to a corporation is, again, for it to cease to exist. But again, that is so exceedingly rare, because most cases would never get to this point, as I said before. When corporations that have been accused under these statutes and that's not unusual, not just Eliot Spitzer, but there have been other cases throughout the country. Those corporations, they realize that they need to sort of acknowledge and put things right, and negotiate a settlement that will not end up in their demise, if you will. So it's not that. It's just that, like I said, it's a very unusual decision, but that's in part because of just the fact that, frankly, Trump didn't have a very good case here, and they probably should have settled. It was within the Attorney General's right. Now, of course, that's going to be tested on appeal. I mean, don't be thinking that, suddenly there's going to be a garage sale tomorrow of all the Trump assets. This is the beginning of a very long journey, I believe.
Got it. And so just for context, how do judges become judges in New York? And and do you have any experience with the judge in this particular case, at Arthur in Goron? I think that's how.
Yeah, and I don't have any experience because he mainly handles civil matters. But judges in New York can become judges in two different ways. They can be appointed by the governor or the mayor, and then elevated. So they can be elevated as acting state Supreme Court judges, or they can be elected. So it's kind of a combination. It's never super clear to me. It's a judicial sort of appointments and judicial elections are kind of very, very murky in New York. So it's a very much, the elective stuff is very much run by the parties and kind of even the county organization. So, but yeah, I'm not specifically familiar how long he's been a judge or whether he's elected or appointed, but in any event, that's what I know.
Okay. So, all right. So the decision is 35 pages. Can you maybe, and it's filled with a bunch of legalese, so someone that's not a lawyer like myself, and I'm sure the majority of the people listening to this, walk us through how the judge reached his decision. Because again, I peruse through it. I kind of pick out little stuff that just sticks out for me. But there was obviously like a thought process, I'm assuming, that the judge went through to reach the decision that he did.
Yeah, I mean, in essence, it literally comes down to the judge's job, right, is ultimately to, manage the cases in front of him and decide whether there are issues of fact for, trial, right? I mean, it's a waste of judicial resources. It's a waste of, citizens' time. It's a waste of, the system. If it's the civil law, whether we think it's fair or not, if there is no issue of fact, it doesn't go to trial. And again, there is going to be a trial aspect to this, and that's what's also interesting, is that you have a situation where there's certain things alleged, but some things do need to go to trial, some things do not. So that is the rightful exercise of judicial power to kind of go through. So his reasoning really comes down to the fact that the standard here is objective, falsification. Again, it's not about, whether Trump believed that it was worth $1 billion. It's about whether objectively was, for example, let's use Mar-a-Lago as an example. Was it really worth $1 billion? Now, I think what, a normal person who's, lived in the world, right, and has ever dealt with real estate in any, any form, knows that, housing prices can change, right? And, or real estate prices can change, right? So is it fair to say, well, what the county says, 18 million is the value as opposed to $1 billion? And I think that's a fair criticism, but this is the thing. Number one, the $18 million that the judge cites as the value for Mar-a-Lago, that wasn't just some clerk putting that on there. That actually came about because Trump himself said the assessed value is too high. And in New York especially, I live in a co-op building, which is just a fancy way of saying a condo and we pay, obviously we pay real estate taxes. And every year in New York City, they come up with a new valuation for the value of our entire building. And every year we contest it. And this is it's called a certiorari action, and every building in New York does this. And so let's just say, for argument's sake, they say it's worth $1 million, this entire building, and we say it's really worth 500,000, and then they come to a number in the middle, and that's the basis for what our property taxes are, right? So an individual homeowner doesn't do that in New York or anywhere else, but in sort of for big buildings and things like that, because these buildings are worth a lot of money. Obviously, our our 12 story building's probably worth a lot more than $1 million. I don't remember what it was, but the point is, your taxes are tied directly to those assessed values. So in Trump's case, in Mar-a-Lago's case, that 18 million was after lots of lawyering and pushing to say this is what it should be valued at. Now, in the case, on the other side, the flip side, when he goes to get loans, again, he's valuing it at $1 billion. Now, it is totally fair to say, okay, maybe 18 million is low. And like I said, maybe make my building, if somehow they could sell the entire building, maybe it would be really worth, in my example, not 1 million, but 3 million. But, this is not, 18 million is 20 times like that's 1/20th of what he thinks it was, and there's a reason that he would value it more in the other context, right? So he wants to pay low taxes with the county or the state, but when he went to Deutsche Bank and wanted to use this collateral or for whatever else, you want to look as flush as possible. That gives you the best possible terms for the loan. And so there's a reason for that. So it's what the judge did, to just go back to your original question. The judge methodically went through all of the arguments and kind of summarized to date. Now, we had a complaint, we had an answer, we had discovery. Now here is where we are, right? And they're basically, he's deciding the motions, if you will, saying, okay, this is the last stop before trial, and here's what I've decided. So he went through all of the, the allegations, and because these are objective things, and it has to do with this civil law, right? Which is, not unusual, but there's some corporate laws. New York has these two laws. The criminal side is the Martin Act, and the general business law is the other side, that they don't, require, sort of intent or that you believe it. It's just objectively true or false. And because it is objectively not true that it was worth $1 billion. If it had been closer, if his valuation had been, I don't know, $40 million, sure that the judge would have, granted summary judgment. It's just the wildly inflated numbers. And this is something that Trump has done his entire existence, right? He's a big talker, and that's what a lot of real estate people are, big talkers, and it's worked for him. So it's not a surprise that he did. But unfortunately, in this case, it has now come back to bite him. So I don't know if that gives you a little bit of kind of what the judge did, and then I can talk about what
it does. Yeah. So I mean, if he's claiming that, for instance, Mar-a-Lago is worth $1 billion, wouldn't there be a tax record that would show that he paid a percentage off that billion? If I'm understanding that right.
No. So in other words, okay, let's say you buy your house, or let's do an example like in New York. Okay, so New York City, right? Apartments are, we live like Veal. We live in tiny apartments, and they're worth a lot of money. And so, a one-bedroom apartment. Let's say a one-bedroom apartment in 1985 sold for $100,000. Right? That same one-bedroom apartment now, and just in Manhattan, probably sells for between $600,000 and $700,000, right? So if you've owned that apartment since 1985, right, you were lucky enough to buy it, when it was, maybe the market was low or whatever it is, right? And then you ultimately, now you want to go to sell it in 2023 for $700,000. You're not in any, you've just, you've held on to it long enough. It's appreciated, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, And so if Trump, whenever he bought Mar-a-Lago, I think in maybe the late 80s, early 90s, whatever he paid for it is what it was. And if he had just sort of, gotten a mortgage or paid for it and then sold it, whatever the market value is now is what the market value is. But the valuation at the, what we're talking about, that 18 million, there's always going to be every single, piece of real property in the county clerk of wherever you live, they have a valuation. And again, they use that number to, what a percentage of that $18 million is how they figured out his yearly property taxes. But that number, as we know, just conventional wisdom tells us that is not necessarily what the apartment or the piece of property is worth. It's often worth more than that. So again, if this were a case where the, comparable properties, and that's how you kind of figure this out, right? If a comparable property, and I know Mar-a-Lago is a very unique property, but comparable, seaside mansions with
Mhm.
no development rights in Palm Beach sell for $40 million, $50 million. That's a fair kind of way to assess it. You can't just say, and I think one of the more funny things in the record was something to the effect of they had an expert, real estate broker down there saying, I could, I can definitely sell this for $1 billion. And the judge, I think in his deposition, he was asked for, to whom do you have a buyer? And he's like, anyone between, my, Elon Musk and
Yeah. Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. And it's like, well, how many people are between them for?
That's funny. Yeah.
And, so it's not like, saying that generally, there's probably someone who buy it is different than there's actually, here's, Joe Billionaire saying, I want to buy it for $1 billion. Then that would be, legitimate, right?
It's funny. Is that related to the whole line about I can find a buyer from Saudi Arabia to pay any price?
Yeah, I think that is. Yeah, I think that's his point. Is like there's just a ton of billionaires, hanging around who, are waiting, for the right property like Mar-a-Lago to come out and they'll pay $1 billion. But saying I can find them and not having them, right? I mean, it is very, very curious that he couldn't name, again, Joe Billionaire, who's
Mhm.
who's approached me and said, the minute it comes online, please, let me know.
Yeah. So like, I guess why is like Mar-a-Lago even included in this? Because it's New York. So
Right.
like, kind of help me explain why New York, or why Mar-a-Lago's even listed in there.
Yeah, because it all comes down to, the jurisdiction here, and the reach of this case has to do with the entities and their property. So in other words, the Donald J. Trump or DJT Revocable Trust, right? There are all these properties that they're based. The trust is based here in New York City, right? But the properties can be anywhere. I mean, they could be all over the country, it could be all over the world. It's whatever they own that are pertain to these companies fall under the auspices. One of the funnier things that again my colleague Mitch Epner was telling me about, which I think was so funny, is that apparently the Trump organization, Donald Trump has assigned his publicity rights to the Trump org. So in other words, that means that, anything he promotes is technically owned by one of these LLCs, which means that theoretically, this is one of the assets that's going to, if this goes through, could be dissolved, so that Trump himself would not be, in a position to, he'd be answerable to whoever buys up those rights and would have to promote, those things as opposed to himself, which is very, I mean, it's a little bit speculative, but it's one of the more quirky things that talk about an unintended consequence when, he probably did that, under advice of tax lawyers, to sort of minimize, liabilities and things like that. But now it become, his own likeness and ability to, his, frankly, the thing that he's probably the best at, he could theoretically be used for something else, for the things he would want.
Oh, that's so crazy. Okay, so what's a statement of financial condition? That's something that I keep seeing a lot.
So a statement of financial condition is when you have certain types of loans. So again, use it like our situation, right? If you have a mortgage, you don't have, once you get the mortgage, you don't have to send the bank every year, show that you have a job and you still have, money in the bank account. Like, right, whatever you had at the time is enough. But with these types of, large, very, hefty loans, and with a corporation, right, they have to show their liabilities, their debts, what they own. So it's more than a balance sheet, which just would be like, liabilities and assets, right? So, it's basically a picture of what the company is. And that's just a requirement, again, of the various loans that he, meaning, when I say he, I mean, the Trump organization and these LLCs had to provide to, lenders like Deutsche Bank and the other big companies, big banks that they were getting money from. And what's particularly, sort of awful for Mr. Trump is that because they had to file these every year, it kept reviving the fraud. So one of the big arguments that the lawyers made on behalf of the Trump organization in this case and Trump was that it's too old, that the statute of limitations has run. And the statute of limitations is generally 5 years, and it depends on, some things have a little bit shorter, some things a little bit longer, but let's just say it's 5 years. And so, in fact, there was an appellate decision that took Ivanka out of the case because of the statute of limitations. But that's because of her involvement sort of ended, I guess in 2012, I think. And obviously we're way past 2012, and this was filed in 2022, so that would take her out of it. So the thing is, though, everyone else was actively involved in the company, and so every year that the statement of financial condition was filed with these false statements, it kind of kept the statute of limitations going.
Got it. Okay, so so the evidence used for this case, I'd imagine, revolved around the AG, like getting bank records, tax statements, stuff like that. Like, what was there? I have a hard time believing that the banks would just be like, here you go. So like, would there, or maybe the better question is, like, how is that possible, and why didn't the banks put up more of a fight, or did they?
Oh no, they subpoenaed the banks, right? I mean, so you can't. They whether they fought, I don't recall them fighting these subpoenas. I mean, certainly Trump famously challenged it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and those have to do more with the grand jury subpoenas, which were even kind of more incredible that it got as far as it did, because I know from, again, time as a prosecutor, grand jury subpoenas, very little. You don't need to have, be able to prove a case. You need to just have a reasonable belief that, something is afoot. You have to give you can't do it frivolously. And so similarly here, there was a subpoena, and, there was certainly lots of litigation, but yes, they were able to get it. And even with Mazars, his account, they were able to subpoena the account. So there was lots of ways to get this evidence. This is not a criminal case, but another way that, government can get things, of course, is in a search warrant. Although obviously this is not a criminal case, so that didn't happen here. This is really subpoenas.
Got it. So a couple of arguments that I've heard both Trump and a lot of his surrogates make are, using something about like the disclaimer clause. Trump calls it like a non-reliance clause. Like, what's that all about?
Yeah, this should be worthless. It's literally called the worthless clause. And that's essentially what's funny about that is that. Yes, he sort of, hung his hat on the fact that, Mazars is saying, you can't rely on this because, this is just because we're just basing this on what we have. And so you're saying, so that means that none of this is true. And the reason they call it a worthless clause is not because it's worthless. It's because essentially, he's just sort of focusing on the first half. It's like, if I said, I killed my husband, and you said, oh, wow, that's an admission. But I said, because he had a gun to my head, right? That changes the meaning a whole lot. Right? Maybe I have a self-defense claim, right? In this situation, it's similar, right? The worthless clause, if you will, that you can't, essentially that this is based on the information provided to us by our client. And, we have done our best to, ascertain, that this is, all the information, and that we are basing our sort of valuation on what he's provided. So it's essentially, you've heard that phrase, garbage in, garbage out, right? That's essentially what it is. They're saying, look, this is the best that we can do, but we're not going to say, but that doesn't mean it's not true. It means this is the evaluation. That's how accountants work. So you certainly, if their arguments had any merit, then there would be no point of ever having auditors or, the financial people do anything, because you couldn't rely on them and just say, okay, That's not what this is. That's just, hey, we're the accountants. We're getting the information. This is based on all the information our client has given us. Based on that, we've come up with this.
Got it. So on Truth Social, I'm going to read you a quote here from Trump. So he says, all the banks and lenders did their own due diligence on the financing. All operational loans and business loans were paid back. There are no defaults or banking interests adversely impacted. And there was probably a lot more about, racist Letitia James or whatever, like after that. But is that statement true? And like the fact that the banks didn't seem to have any issues with it, does that sort of minimize, the I don't know, the argument here?
It doesn't, and it's a kind of common tool in the kind of toolkit of a defense attorney, is to try to make the standard of what the crime or the law, in this case, not a crime, requires. So the fact that Deutsche Bank still is alive and well and lending money and got their money back doesn't matter. You don't have to prove harm to the bank. You have to, the law, the standard, that is broken here is whether or not, that they obtained financing under fraudulent circumstances by the basis of using fraudulent claims. And again, it's about the objective. Is using Mar-a-Lago, is it really worth $18 million? Is it worth $18 million or $1 billion? Well, maybe 18 is too low, but there's no way it's $1 billion. Right. And we also know that because Trump himself, again, in the other hand, contested the higher value. I forgot what it was before it was 18. Right. So that is not, so changing the standard of what the law is, that's why this law is powerful. Again, why other, similarly situated companies who have been come under the crosshairs of an attorney general often look to settle as opposed to, go full throttle, because you can, as much as they wanted to change the standard, that's not the standard. The other thing is, it's not, and I think I said this before, it's not a completely, like, it's not that there was no harm, but he certainly did get a benefit. And he's pretending to say like it wouldn't have mattered, I would have gotten it anyway. Well, the thing is, if in fact he again, I'm using he as the royal he for all the companies and stuff.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
If they had represented the true values, right, the objective values of what these properties are, they likely would have had much less favorable terms of these loans. Right? You or I are going to get a much, again, in the mortgage world, right? We're going to get a much higher rate than a Bill Gates. That's just the way the financial systems work. Mm. And it's not just the rate, but it's also the terms of payback, right? There are benefits that he was able to get based on, this, very, flush portfolio of collateral that had it been represented the way it is. And that's important. The public policy behind this is that we want, there is funding. We want there to be truth in lending. We want there, because it can trickle down, right? If a company like Trump is getting, they're getting all the money, maybe there's less for you and I, where maybe we're higher risks, then it underestimated what his actual risk was. Whether or not he paid it back doesn't matter. I pay my mortgage too, but I am a much higher risk. I can't, you can't give me $1 million, right? I can't, that would be a problem. That would be hard. Mm-hmm.
That's funny. So, one of the things that Trump has also been pushing a lot is, a lot of Letitia James statements prior to becoming the AG. So, I'd love to get your take on, like, will any of those statements, have any lasting repercussions on appeal? Or, it definitely seems like it hurts the optics of this case. So I'd love to kind of just get your take on that.
It's politics. I think that, sure. In a perfect world, people would be pure, and it's like anything else, right? Even think about, we have admissions in college, right? In a perfect world, you just look at the applications and you don't see whether they're women or men or people of color or Americans or foreign, whatever. You don't see anything. You just see the merit, right? And that's it. And so the idea is that in a perfect world, the Attorney General would go in and say, company X is doing this, and and they've not campaigned on prosecuting specifics. So yeah, I mean, it's not great, and it gives him something politically to certainly exploit. So that's not great. Arguably, that she felt that she needed to win, to galvanize New York. Although I would argue in New York, which is a heavily Democratic place, I'm not sure, that was necessary in hindsight. But I'm not a political operative, so I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, optically, sure, it gives him something to say. I think practically speaking, I don't think it's going to matter, because in the end of the day, the evidence is there, and it's, and the evidence is enough there that a judge has, and he didn't, if he had campaigned on, finding against Trump, the Trump organization, that would be different. So the fact that she found a judge to go along with it, and I think it will be, appeal tested. And even if somehow the appeal, it says, no, there should be a trial, I think there's a good chance, I think that you have to infer that a judge is willing to do this. And remember, it's not like he's not blind to the fact that this made major news and that it's a major decision. I presumably he's not a judge. He's not a rogue judge. He understands that it's going to be tested on appeal. But if it were, and if it were to come back, it would just essentially mean it goes to trial, right? That's likely. They're not going to, they aren't going to dismiss it. They'll just say, okay, no, shouldn't have been summary judgment, go to trial. And then it'll be up to a jury, or, and we go from there. So I don't think it's great, but I also think it's realistic. In politics, people say lots of stuff that, later it can be thrown back.
Yeah. So what's a sanction? Like, what does it mean when a lawyer gets sanctioned, and why were I think 7? I can't remember why did the lawyers get sanctioned in this particular case?
So sanction is literally, kind of it's a penalty. I mean, it's very rare. They don't happen often. And yeah, they $7,500 per lawyer, and it's the reason that they were sanctioned here. And it's not the money, by the way. I mean, I'm sure they made $7,500 in 2 hours of work, on this case. So I don't think that's the thing. The thing that's relevant about the sanctions is it's something that the lawyer carries with them throughout, so that if they're in different matters, if they're going to different states and different courts, if they're they will have to disclose that, if essentially they're so it's not a good thing for a lawyer. And the reason that they were sanctioned is that they kept repeating arguments that the judge had deemed frivolous, and he had warned them. He didn't just sanction them out of two, because it is pretty rare. And so that was what happened. Now, again, just like the rest of this will be appealed. The court, it will be interesting to see if they uphold the sanctions, but it's certainly a headache for them. It's one more thing they have to deal with. And that they, appealing the sanctions part, there's no client to bill. They're the client. So.
Got it. So is sanction almost like a parking ticket that just stays in your record?
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. All right. So, last few questions. So when you say, what happened or what was ordered in the decision is like the corporate death penalty, like, is that just in New York, or is that much more broadly, like all the Trump, like, properties, organizations, stuff like that?
So the corporations, they have assets all over the world, right? But there were 10 entities that were named in the decision. If you, again, page 35 is kind of the money page, if you will, right? And that's where it sort of says there are 10 entities. And so what what the judge says is that their certificates, your corporate certificates, are revoked. So a corporate certificate, if you will, is basically proof a corporation exists. It's a birth certificate, right, for a corporation.
Got it.
And by revoking, their certificates, it's essentially issuing a death certificate. So it's killing the corporations. And so what that means is that these corporations can no longer exist as corporations. And they are now going to the next stage, which is if they were to file bankruptcy under Chapter 7, right? A receiver is appointed. Again, using a person as an analogy, you die, you as a dead person can't sell your house, but the executor of your estate does, right? So a receiver is essentially the executor, and they will then, working with the court, and they're now answerable to the court. They are now going to proceed to liquidate the assets. They're going to pay the debts. If they have to pay fines in this case, which could be up to $250 million, they will do that. And in the end, after all that is done, Trump will get, because he is the underlying owner, he will get a pile of cash. And so that's, whatever's left.
Interesting. So can the executor be somebody that doesn't have the last name Trump?
It will certainly be a person that does not have the last name Trump, because it is not up to Trump to pick the receiver in this case, or the executor, right? So it is going to be up to, in fact, that's on page 35. Let me read you that if I can get back to my computer. Hold on. Okay. So it says, within 10 days of the date of this order, the parties are directed to recommend the names of no more than 3 potential independent receivers to manage the dissolution of the canceled LLCs. So independent receivers, right? So that's not going to be Ivanka. It's not going to be Jared. That'll be their
Barron?
kids.
Can it be Barron?
No. Or Tiffany or anyone else.
Or Barron.
No, it's going. I mean, obviously, Letitia James will come up with 3. The Trump lawyers, but again, it's not happening within 10 days. This is going to be an appeal, but yes, they need to come up with 3 people that are independent, and that person is not going to be answerable to Trump. So if Trump says, I don't want to sell the golf course, then they'll just say, too bad, this is what we're doing, right? So it won't be up to him. It won't be up to him to, there's been allegations that he doesn't pay his contractors, right, and builders and things like that. That's no longer up to Donald Trump or, the people that are running the company. Ultimately it will be up to the receiver to kind of figure out, through a complicated process, right, what's owed, who's owed, pay all that, and then, kind of wind it down without, I mean, there could be, certainly through the lawyers, they can say, hey, we don't owe Joe the bricklayer or something like that. But ultimately, it's going to be not their fault.
Got it. What are some arguments that they, or maybe that you predict that they would use on appeal?
Well, I mean, the major thing is that there are questions of fact. That same expert. Well, I think the expert was somewhat laughable. It is an expert. Someone did sign their name and swear to these things. So they might say, let a jury decide that, let a trial, this is a trial issue, shouldn't be the judge, given the tremendous consequences. Just generally speaking, that they can go back to that statute of limitations thing that we talked about, that, this is all too old and it shouldn't be included because there's an argument about when the loan closed. I think the loan closed in 2000. And so they're saying, the Trump's lawyers are saying 2000 should be the last time. And obviously that's 23 years ago. That would be or even 22 years ago from the filing, the case started, and that's too old. And they're sort of referencing another appellate decision that happened in this case, but that's not what the appellate decision said. Was the judge had to rule on when, the loan concluded, and a loan closing is not the same as concluded, right? I have an apartment and I have a mortgage. My loan closed whenever I bought my apartment. but in other words, I got the money for the apartment, but it's not concluded. I wish it were. I still pay it every month. So, right. So that's the difference. Right? Is that you have, so there'll be some arguments about that, oh, should it have been the closing? I mean, look, lawyers, we always find arguments. They may not be the best arguments, but those are the ones I think. I think the best one, honestly, is probably the expert, and saying, hey, there is an issue of fact. I don't think he's a good expert. I think he's kind of funny, but that may be, to your point, Will, like you say, you're a Democrat, right? And you say you're generally not a pro-Trump guy, but even you were saying, is it really fair? Right. And so ultimately, I think it's important, that with so much that's happened in the last 5 years or so, I mean, there's so much mistrust in government. There's so much mistrust in courts. I think it is incumbent upon, the appellate courts to make sure that if in fact this is the correct ruling, that they're very clear in this, because I think people have lost a lot of faith.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so my last question, but probably my most important, like, people that listen to the show know I've got very strong feelings about Trump. I might have even said that if he gets reelected to be president, it will be an extinction level event for America. So I'm curious, like, if he does become president, like, what sort of things could he do, if any, to, change the outcome of what's happening with the Trump org? Because I mean, I'm assuming the whole process is going to be a while. It'll probably extend well into the presidential election. So I mean, are there any actions that he could take at the federal level to throw a wrench into this whole thing?
No, not really, because again, the powers of pardon, which really have to do with criminal cases, not civil cases, right, mean that if in fact Trump were reelected and became president, he could himself, in fact, I think he could pardon himself on the Jack Smith cases, the election fraud, and the classified documents. So those things could be pardoned. But then there's still New York, the New York DA's office case, and there's also the Georgia, Fani Willis case. So you have two state cases, and there is, again, it goes back to our founding, between, states' rights versus federalism, and states do have, sovereignty. So this case, and that's what's, I think, very, particularly scary. I think that's one of the reasons, Trump is a master communicator, is whether you love Trump or hate Trump, you have to admire the incredible skill that, he has been able to do as much as he's done for as long as he's had. And I think that is because he is a master, master communicator and manipulator, of the facts, but so much so that you have him, I think, leading in some polls, right, with 4 indictments, right? So the thing of it is, though, is that he ultimately, I think he came forward with a bunch of, of messages on Truth Social about this, because I think the repercussions, even to Trump now, he realizes he is, this is way beyond what he thought was possible. It doesn't mean it's not possible. It means that I think there was a failure to appreciate how nuclear, if you will, a judge could go, and that it may well be held up, and there may well be nothing that he can do about it. But again, nothing will be decided before the 2024 election. I would be shocked. I mean, the law is not known for its speediness, so I don't think that will happen. But I mean, you never know, of course. But yeah, I think he would be still.
Okay, well, I guess that makes me feel a little bit better. Although knowing Trump, he'll just order the military to go establish martial law in New York or something like that. So. Wouldn't be surprised. Anyways, thank you so much, Diana. This has been awesome. As always, I really appreciate just your expertise, your insight into all this kind of stuff. And yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Anytime. Looking forward to the next installment of the Chronicles.
Yes, indeed. Or the field hearing from Congress that I'm sure is going to find its way there with Jim Jordan, in his rage. So, all right. Well, thanks again. And thank you to our listeners and viewers. We will see you next time. Take care.